from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama,
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty.
I guess I really don't know what Christmas is all about. Isn't there anyone who knows what Christmas is all about? Sure, Charlie Brown. I can tell you what Christmas is all about.
You tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Hello, this is Michael Hart, and you're listening to Unknown America, myths and little-known oddities about the greatest nation on earth on the Hart of America Broadcasting Network. This is yet another addition to the podcast library of, well, for your listening enjoyment. You know, in the book, The Life of Reason, philosopher, writer, and essayist George Santayana famously penned the words, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." What Santayana was referring to is the failures that occur when people do not learn from their past mistakes and continue in their very misguided ways. And in a larger sense, that makes the tragedies that can occur when societies fail to learn, buries the truth of past mistakes, ignores or even revises atrocities, or worse, simply forgets. Over the last several centuries, whether through human error, false reporting, or simple neglect, history has all too often been a victim of forgetfulness or, in many cases, revision. While this program is chock full of historical trivia that many people have either forgotten, never knew, or really, frankly, were never taught, it also serves to set the record straight by smashing some of the most enduring myths and outright lies that have persisted throughout the history of this country. During this program, you're going to learn about some of the most famous Americans that shaped this nation, as well as people that you may never have heard of that the history books either ignored, stories were forgotten, altered, or considered not worth telling until now. During this program, you'll also learn some fascinating facts about the American culture and even about some of the little-known oddities of the American experience. Simply stated, there's a lot of history in the past, and unfortunately too much of it ignored, changed to fit a narrative, or deemed not worthy of being taught. So be prepared to be amazed while you learn about some of those fascinating people, places, plans, and peculiarities that make up the unknown America. And today, we're going to take a trip into the past and explore a little bit about the unknown framers. But I want to preface this program, as I probably will each, and just for those of you that are tuning in, we are going to be doing this once a week where we visit American history as part of the regular offerings of the Hart of America Broadcasting Network. The situational security broadcast will also play into that. We'll be back to our standard news format tomorrow, frankly, when Megan Barth joins us. But the simple fact of the matter is, much of what goes on in this country is perpetrated by a very complicit news media. And that doesn't, I don't always necessarily mean that in harsh sense or in the fake news sense. Sometimes the press just gets it wrong. There's stories throughout history where the media has repeated many different types of stories that were just so lacking in fact, or they didn't vet them out, or perhaps the stories were at a time in American history when it was much more difficult to vet these stories out. And the simple fact of the matter is they morph their way into the history books, and they become enduring myths. The president, Donald Trump, has oftentimes referred to the media as purveyors of fake news. That's not entirely inaccurate. The reality of it is that the media has, for the longest period of time, played a role in crafting the national narrative. One of the very first presidents to ever complain about the press was, in fact, Thomas Jefferson. And so it goes throughout the history of this country that we are taking many of our young folks and not just indoctrinating them, but we are not teaching them to be critical thinkers and, frankly, to doubt what they're being taught or told. Not that they shouldn't believe their teachers, but that they shouldn't take it at face value, nor should their parents. So this is all pretty much from the book Unknown America. Some of the content that you'll hear today, like what we're doing today, is actually in the first edition of Unknown America. Some of the content in future episodes of this broadcast will be information that will appear in the second version and the third version. I can create a version a month and never run out of material because pretty much everything that we have learned about many of the most important dates in American history are, again, embellished or they're just entirely wrong. Some of the things that you'll learn today are just odd facts, cute little notions, and like I said a moment ago, peculiarities. Some of these things, however, might change the way you view some of the framers and founding fathers. I think it's very important to note that we often get the founders of this nation confused with one another. And what I mean by that is this. You'll often hear the term founding fathers. Sometimes it's framers. You know, it can be the early patriots or whatever the case may be. The founding fathers and the framers weren't necessarily the same people. You know, if you take a look, for example, in the attempts to compel the colonies to ratify the Constitution, three of the most, brilliant founders in this country are the ones responsible for authoring the Federalist Papers, known then simply as the Federalist. They were Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, none of which had anything to do with the Declaration of Independence. I think sometimes we get it in our head that all the names of old, if they lived in the 1700s, they must have been a framer, they must have been a founder, they must have been a signer. And nothing could be further from the truth. The actual framers of the Constitution were a vastly smaller group than what we might consider the founders of this nation, and each of them playing an entirely different role than the other. The men credited with the idea that would become the American experiment were some of the most brilliant in history. Courage, vision, wisdom, they were common to most, and although their individual contributions to the new nation varied, most are regarded as true statesmen. Many of the founders were actually younger than 40 years old in 1776. Several, such again as Alexander Hamilton, were in their 20s. Hamilton was just 21 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Again, Hamilton himself did not sign the document. We tend to see these guys much older than they actually were because of portrayals and paintings that have portrayed them later in life, most during their respective times while serving as presidents or Supreme Court justices. At the time of the Revolutionary War, most of them were actually quite young. The cause of liberty was actually a young man and young woman's cause. I don't want to compare them to the oftentimes misguided millennials or liberals of today, the younger set, but it has in our history been the case that if substantive change is made, it typically comes from the ranks of the younger, but then there's always an element of having some kind of a elderly supervision that also takes place. But just to give you an idea, some of the youngsters at the time of the Declaration included, and not all these were signers of the Declaration, James Monroe was 18 years old. Nathan Hale was 21. Governor Morris, and he wasn't a governor, but that's his name, Governor Morris, 24 years old. Henry Knox, 25. James Madison, 25. John Jay, 30. Jefferson was just 33. Samuel Chase, 35. And Ethan Allen was 38. John Hancock and Thomas Paine were both 39, which rounded out the most familiar class of the under 40-somethings. The oldest framers were John Hart, a very distant relative, Stephen Hopkins at the age of 69, Benjamin Franklin, 70, and Samuel Whitmore was 81 years of age. It would be beyond the scope of possibility, unless we just invested an enormous amount of time, to break down the contributions of all of the Founding Fathers, because the Founding Fathers is a much broader group than the framers themselves. And I say that because it's important to note that you have the Declaration era in our history. Then you have the Constitution era going into the 1780s, Constitution era, the Federalist era, if you will, leading up into the implementation era, putting these things to paper, to pen, to practice. And so it's very important that you understand there's a vast group of people that had a major and significant role in the forming of this nation. And what we're going to do today is take about a half a dozen of them and share with things you might not have known about the men that made America what she is today. And we will start with the most obvious place to start, and that would be George Washington. Washington was born on the 11th day of February in 1731 under the Julian calendar. And now in the early 1750s, Great Britain converted to the Gregorian calendar, and so an adjustment was made, and Washington's birthday actually became February 22nd, 1732, and not February 11th, 1731. He also gave the shortest inauguration speech in American history. This would have been in March of 1793. It was a walloping 133 words. Oh, don't you long for the day? At the time of his inauguration, Washington owned the largest whiskey distillery in the entire country. He also would bow at presidential receptions to avoid physical contact of a handshake. This new tradition would last through the presidency of John Adams. Washington would actually rest one hand on his sword and the other holding a hat to avoid a remote possibility of anyone forcing a handshake. He was a germaphobe. It was Thomas Jefferson that ended the tradition by shaking hands when greeting people. Washington's so-called wooden teeth that we've learned about since first grade were actually made from real human teeth. He actually bought these teeth from some of his own slaves. Washington died on the 14th of December, 1799, and his last words were, "I die hard, but I'm not afraid to go. Let me go quietly. I cannot last long. It is well." Washington was so afraid of being buried alive that he asked in his will that he not be interred until 3 days after his death. Currently, the first president of the United States of America, George Washington, currently owes roughly $300,000 in overdue library book fines. One of the more colorful Americans from the chapter, The Unknown Framers in the book, Unknown America, was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was known as quite the prankster. At just 16 years of age, he regularly published editorials under the pseudonym Ms. Silence Dogood, the character that he created. The writings of Dogood were so liked that a few eligible bachelors even mailed marriage proposals to the fictitious Silence Dogood. Franklin actually often wrote with fake names, and many times did so while enjoying what he called an air bath. Yep, Franklin wrote in the nude. One of his most peculiar writings was an essay encouraging scholars to find a method for, quote, improving the odor of human flatulence. Yeah. Throughout his life, Franklin was credited with authoring many hoaxes. Because of this, he was not allowed to pen the Declaration of Independence. It was actually feared by his contemporaries that he would slip a joke into the document, which, considering his history, was a valid concern. Along with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, Franklin was tapped with the job of creating the official seal for the new nation. After several artistic renderings, each of which portrayed an eagle, in a letter to his daughter, Franklin famously mocked the final choice, the American bald eagle. In his letter, Franklin declared the bald eagle was a bad choice for the new nation's official seal because, quote, it was a bird of bad moral character that does not get his living honestly. Franklin opined that he felt the turkey would be a better choice because it was a bird of courage and would not hesitate to attack a grenadier of the British Guards. The letter has caused some historians and many people to falsely believe that it is proof he preferred the turkey to the bald eagle on the official seal of America, when in reality the letter was likely mere satire, again, as he was known to do, since it was known that old Ben Franklin actually preferred no fowl at all. Very oftentimes we have conversations about the context of the times and how sometimes that can apply to the United States Constitution. There are certain words within the Constitution, like the word regulated, for example, that meant something slightly different then than it does now. So it's worth noting that Franklin's concern over the morality of the eagle was a common belief of most of the framers was that work ethic was central to their definition of morality. When they spoke of morality, they were not referring to anything having to do with lawlessness or promiscuity, but rather service and contribution to the good of the nation. History books have often portrayed Benjamin Franklin as some kind of, and we tend to do this, frankly, we canonize these guys because they were there in the early days. But I think it's important to realize that they were human beings, and some of them just plain weird. I mean, think about it for a second. If you really put yourself in their position at the time, the Revolutionary War period, it seems that it's been portrayed as so heroic, and it certainly was. But these folks, in many senses, were an odd mishmash, a menagerie of different personalities and beliefs and desires and goals and kinks. Franklin was known for his suave demeanor. In fact, it's partly why he was selected to win France's support during the Revolutionary War. But he also used that charm to bed women and was very open about sex. One of Franklin's letters outlines advice on finding a mistress. One of his recommendations was to always go for older women. According to Franklin, and I'm quoting him, their age and wisdom makes them discreet partners, and their faded looks makes them especially grateful for the attention. Plus, while the face first grows lank and wrinkled, then the neck, then the breast and arms, the lower parts continue to last as plump as ever. This was just one of old Ben Franklin's older lover observations. Yes, Benjamin Franklin was a playboy. But not all of them were as pristine as the history books would lead us to believe. And they all had very unique personalities. They were all pretty much charismatic. If you think about it from the perspective of the time, they would have just to have had to been. The life of Alexander Hamilton is also worth taking a peek into, as Hamilton founded the New York Post newspaper, a paper famous for exposing, among other saucy news stories, the sexual exploits of future U.S. politicians, typically with provocative headlines. However, oddly enough, Hamilton was the first American politician to have his career ruined by a sex scandal. Oh, but for the irony. As the story goes, in 1791, Hamilton, who was a married man, met a young Philadelphia woman by the name of Maria Reynolds. Reynolds came to Hamilton claiming she needed cash because her husband had abandoned her and she had a small daughter to support. Hamilton agreed to help, but their financial arrangement soon escalated into a romantic entanglement as the pair embarked on an affair that would last, by some estimates, for years. After hearing of the tryst, Maria's husband James returned home, seeing the profit potential in the situation. And James, bent on exploiting the circumstances, devised a devious plot. For it was on December 15th of that year, Hamilton received a note from Maria informing him that her husband would soon be threatening to tell Mrs. Hamilton of the affair. And as predicted, 2 days later, Hamilton received a letter from James Reynolds that accused him of destroying a happy home, and he proposed a solution. Reynolds' pain could be assuaged if Hamilton would agree to fork over the cash. Hamilton agreed, and so Maria's husband allowed the relationship to continue, and a pattern was established in which Maria, which, by the way, by this time had likely become complicit in her husband's scheme, also seeing the profit potential, would write to Hamilton, inviting him to visit her when her husband was out of the house, and shortly after these meetings, quite predictably, James would request another payoff. Because he was Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and out of fear of exposure, Hamilton readily coughed up the cash each time, and eventually Hamilton was forced to admit to the affair after James Reynolds threatened to implicate him in a scheme involving unpaid back wages intended for Revolutionary War veterans. Hamilton's reputation remained in tatters up to the fateful day on the morning of July 11, 1804, when he lost a duel to Aaron Burr, with Hamilton dying the following day. It's strangely coincidental that in 1801, Hamilton's son Philip was killed in a duel at the exact same location in Weehawken, New Jersey, where his father would die. Philip was presumably defending his father's honor against a man he had felt besmirched his character earlier that year. Stranger still is that it's widely believed that Alexander Hamilton died in the duel with Burr because he missed on purpose. It has been reported that the senior Hamilton, who was present at his son's duel, advised him to miss on purpose, a mistake that the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury apparently failed to learn from 3 years later. Much has also been written about the life and times of John Hancock, another one of our most famous framers. Despite the lore, it's simply not true that Hancock's oversized signature on the Declaration of Independence was done to taunt the King of England. The legend goes that Hancock stated that, quote, "that fat old king could read it without his spectacles," although numerous variations of Hancock's quote have been passed down through history, such as, quote, "the British ministry can read that name without spectacles, let them double their reward." In reality, Hancock was the first to sign simply because he was the president of the Continental Congress. All the paintings that you have seen with the other signers looking on is just another example of revisionist history. There was actually only one other person even present in the room at the time that Hancock put pen, or I guess in this case quill, to paper, meaning no one really knows what he said, if anything. And the fact that the story didn't even originate until many years later makes it all the more suspicious and unlikely. Hancock's signature was also printed and not signed on the parchment that would become the final declaration that we all know. The signature was applied to the document once the now iconic version was sent to the printer. It's also likely that the parchment that Hancock signed originally was actually blank at the time. All of this meaning that John Hancock didn't have an idea how big the typeface would be, and therefore no way to gauge how large to sign. Some historians have also speculated that part of the reason for Hancock signing a blank page might have been because his signature would have provided evidence of treason if things did not go well in the war, a concern other signers were known to share. Another persistent myth is that the Declaration was signed by the delegates on July 4th, when in actuality, signing for most of them did not even begin until August 2nd of that year. They didn't all live in Philadelphia. Some historians even believed that the signing continued through the summer and all the way in to November of that year. They just kind of popped by. A couple of them, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, signed the darn thing just so they could say they signed the Declaration of Independence. Again, we see these portrayals of, the powdered-haired, older wig guy standing on the table and arguing the Declaration as they line up to sign. Nothing. And I mean nothing could be further from the truth. Most of the portraits that you see or the paintings that you see actually portray the framers and or founding fathers, and they are, by the way, two different groups of people, in a different light later in life when some of them had served in the Congress or served as president or served, on the Supreme Court. Because, there was not obviously photographic evidence. And so many painters of the historical ilk simply took liberties with what they thought the event would have looked like. There were all kinds of commonly held myths in American history, and frankly, almost every single one of our most valued framers and or founders is dogged by a myth. Another one of them is Samuel Adams. Although commonly referred to as the father of America, Adams was a failure in business. From 1756 to 1764, Adams worked as a tax collector. As tax rates mounted, it became more difficult for the colonists to pay up. As an advocate for the underprivileged, coupled with his poor business acumen, Adams often simply looked the other way. Although he would gain the affection of cash-strapped taxpayers, it was actually Samuel Adams that was in part responsible for the money issues that the new nation faced. Incidentally, Adams became personally responsible for these debts, which of course he could not pay. Adams' financial struggles were not limited to his professional life as a tax collector. He also struggled to manage his own money as well. As such, the father of America often saw his family languish near poverty. Although Adams was not near the top of the chain of command, he was often chosen to be the rebellious colonist spokesman. He was not a physically imposing man, and he had a weak voice, but was said to move audiences by his sheer intellect and passion. Thomas Jefferson actually referred to him as truly the man of the Revolution. Throughout the book, Unknown America, which this particular broadcast is based upon, we intersperse much of the prose with what are referred to as Mythbuster alerts, certain things that are just not right, things that are so embellished. The story of Betsy Ross is completely fabricated. The story of the Mayflower, pretty much revised. Sacagawea, and I can go on. The Star-Spangled Banner, how it came to be. Slavery in the new states and how slavery came to the Americas and the first slave holders in America. And we're going to cover all this in future editions of Unknown America here on the Heart of America Talk Radio Network. All of these things are explored in the book Unknown America. And I will actually take the idea of Mythbuster alerts into the second edition, where it will be almost exclusively Mythbuster alerts, because much of what we think we know in this country is simply not true. Some of it completely realigns what we think about this nation, and a lot of times for the better. Sometimes you'll hear things and go, well, I'll be darned. I had no idea. It won't really be life-changing. It won't be life-altering. But it will show you that there, are some broadcasters that will refer to indoctrination and as a war on for your mind, etc. Well, there always has been. Sometimes it comes in the form of the media. Sometimes it comes in the form of marketing. Because it always comes down to the almighty green. So sometimes you have a complicit press over here trying to craft and sell a narrative, and other times you just have savvy Madison Avenue executives doing it as well. Despite popular lore, Samuel Adams did not brew beer. He did work for his father's malt house, which made malt that was then sold to breweries. However, after his father's death, old Sam took control of the family business, and from this point on would never be as successful as when Papa Adams ran the operation. The image on the bottles of Sam Adams beers is also not of that of Adams. Sam Adams' hair turned very gray early. He was also a sloppy dresser and had dull, washed-out eyes. The Patriot that adorns the label of the popular brews is most assuredly that of another patriot, Paul Revere. Throughout the course of American history, much debate has circled around whether or not the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Certainly, it was founded on Christian Judeo principles. Some of them were Christians. Some of them were deists, which a deist does believe in a higher creator, just not one that interacts with humanity. There's a master designer, if you will, but a rather passive one. And then there were people, and there weren't many, but there were a few, like Thomas Paine, who was an atheist. Paine wrote the first volume of The Age of Reason, in which he actually makes an argument for deism while in prison in 1793 during the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. Paine had moved to France after the U.S. Revolution and was eventually arrested for treason by the French. Apparently, one revolution was not enough to quell his appetite for rebel rousing. You have to bear in mind that Paine would have been a British subject, and the French Revolution would have been a fight with the British. While in prison in France in 1793, Paine narrowly escapes execution in a most I guess, ironic and or coincidental way. In that particular day, it was common for guards to chalk the doors of those that had been condemned to die. And the day came when it was Paine's turn. However, since he was suffering from a fever, the guards agreed to keep his door open to allow fresh air into his room while he was waiting to be executed. Oh, those mannered Frenchmen. As a result, the door was chalked, but on the inside. When it was later closed for the evening, the guards on duty at the time missed the chalk mark that had been marked on Paine's door, and so he narrowly escaped the guillotine. He was freed in 1794 thanks to the efforts of James Monroe, then the U.S. ambassador to France. Only 6 people attended the funeral for Thomas Paine. This would have been in 1809. This was due to his atheistic views and his condemnation of the Bible and organized religion. Many former friends and colleagues had turned their backs on Thomas Paine. In 1964, the mayor of Thetford in Norfolk, which was Paine's hometown, said that he would only approve a statue of Paine if it was stamped with the words, "Convicted Traitor." However, the statue was eventually erected, sans the label, but with Paine holding his book, Rights of Man, upside down, supposedly to get people talking about the often very controversial works of this very controversial American patriot. Throughout this country's history, and certainly in the formative years, there was a lot of debate over Christianity, deism, atheism, and what role that these things would play in the founding of the new nation. And I'm often fascinated about the amazing inaccuracies that are contained in our history books, simply because there were so many things that went into the foundation. Now, you got to bear in mind, though, even in the time of the early founding of this country, the early portion of the 19th century, all the way to the 20th century, it was to a degree thought that people could only assimilate or learn or assume so much in terms of data, in terms of information. So not only were many of these founding fathers culturally canonized, but a lot of their stories left untold. Some of it simply does not matter. Sometime in the next week or so, we're going to visit another chapter that's going to get into a lot of the things that are not known in this country about the contributions of the black community to the culture of this nation. And the reason we do that is that there's a lot of falsehoods that have plagued the black race. One of them, which frankly was the inspiration for me to actually write the book as well as to create this podcast, is the story of Rosa Parks. Now, the fact that another woman, and I'll get into this in detail in a future edition of Unknown America here on the Hart of America Talk Radio Network, but the fact that another woman, actually a couple, did it before Rosa Parks, talking about the bus boycott or the refusing to move the seat on the bus, which inspired the Montgomery bus boycott. The fact that somebody else did it first is not that historically life-altering, but it's why she was promoted as the first. That's the real issue. Because the news media, in this case, they ran with the story they were told. But throughout history, much of it has been ignored or whitewashed. The framers that we discussed this morning today, they're not alone. This was a short list. In future editions of this program, we'll get a little more in depth, but they were certainly no less colorful, such as Gouverneur Morris. Morris was an accomplished statesman that ushered in the era of a person being a citizen of the Union and not the individual states. Quite a diverse response among the Founding Fathers, as so many of them were states' rights advocates, except for Morris. As a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, he played a leading role, speaking more often than any other delegate and contributing substantially to the writing of the United States Constitution. He was a fierce critic of Thomas Jefferson. He was sharply critical of the foreign policy pursued by both Jefferson and James Madison, particularly their alleged hostility to Great Britain. He believed the War of 1812 to be unjust, unwise, and mismanaged. The War of 1812 was, for all intent and purposes, our second Revolutionary War. It was, as some historians claim, and we'll do this in future editions of the program, as we break down things like the administration of Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Reserve Act, and so many of the relationships between America and bankers abroad. But the War of 1812 was a second attempt by the British Crown to bring the United States of America back up under a European banking system. That is beyond the scope of today's program, but it's also worth noting that some of the wars, and a lot of people, they think the Tea Party, for example, was the inspiration for the Revolutionary War. Actually, it was a thing called the Commerce Clause and another legal case that we're not going to get into today that was referred to as the Parsons Cause. The Parsons Cause actually attempted to set the salaries of Anglican ministers predicated on the harvest cost of wheat. It's kind of complicated, but it was the colonists fighting back against them being taxed to pay for Anglican ministers in the new country. So there are a lot of different impetuses, if you will, that drove hostilities and the early behaviors of the framers and the Founding Fathers. And the War of 1812 is a fascinating period in American history that we'll be covering in depth in a future edition of this program. Gouverneur Morris was one of the few delegates at the Philadelphia Convention to speak openly against slaveholding. According to James Madison, who took notes at the convention, Morris made the case that it was incorrigible to say that a slave was both a man and a property at the same time. Gouverneur Morris died a most peculiar and rather disgusting death. Morris, who had a lifelong medical issues, including an amputated calf, was suffering from a urinary blockage, but instead of seeking medical help to alleviate the problem, Gouverneur Morris decided on a home remedy instead. For the male listeners to this broadcast, this might be a little painful for you. His solution: he attempted to clear the blockage by forcing a piece of whalebone into the, let's just say, opening of his parts. He had actually performed this procedure on himself successfully before. However, this time he lacerated the interior of his manhood, and the wound became infected, and Governor Morris died of the infection on the 6th of November, 1816, at the age of 64. Again, these are but a few of the stories from America's past. Some we have smashed, some myths, others are simply worth historical note. They are all contained in the book, The Unknown America. Future editions of this program will go very in-depth into other things that have formulated this country. And just to give you a brief idea of some of the things that we've covered in our writings, in our speeches, and in the book, Unknown States, The Unknown Americans, Fascinating Americans that history books have ignored, Unknown Americana, little-known facts about life in America, Unknown Military History, Odd Plans and Little-known Events, Bizarre Ideas in Defense of America. We even cover unknown sports, weird stats and facts from the playing field. Before America, what America looked like before it was America. The unknown presidents, stuff you just never learned in school. Unknown black history, the often ignored facts and faces that helped shape America. Unknown framers is what we've covered today, at least a portion of them. Unknown religion, from the subliminal to the sublime, a peek inside worship in the United States. And unknown politics, weird stuff you probably didn't know you didn't know. All of this coming up on future editions of Unknown America with Michael Hart, yours truly, here on the Hart of America Talk Radio Network. If you'd like to pick up a copy of the book, by the way, hopefully the Kindle version will be released within the next 3 or 4 days. Of course, the book is available at all fine bookstores across the country, but you can get an autographed copy of it with a Constitution shipped out to you for free by going to the website, theunknownamerica.com, theunknownamerica.com. We're also working on a children's book, and there are certain things in the children's book that we'll be able to share with them, sans the Governor Morris death entry, for example. So we invite you to check that out. You can find out more, again, by going to theunknownamerica.com. And, of course, we invite you to tune in to the Michael Hart Show every single, or one version of it or another, every single day, beginning at 8 o'clock Central Time, a.m. at heartofamerica.net. It's H-A-R-T, heartofamerica.net. Please go check that out. And on future editions of this program, again, we will be covering so many of these subject matters that we shared with you today. We appreciate all of the support that we've done over the last several years as we've continued this project. It's been an absolute joy. It's been a labor of love, and we've had a wonderful, wonderful time educating folks on some of the most amazing things as it relates to the country, this nation. That's it for us. You've been listening to, well, The Unknown America, right here on the Heart of America Talk Radio Network with your host, Michael Hart. Until next time, bye-bye now.